Christopher Scase, young, handsome entrepreneur. He finds epic success in the 80s.
He came with that cowboy energy. He was doing big things.
Scase becomes a media mogul.
He outbid the legendary Rupert Murdoch.
His empire teeters, but he outfoxes them all. I'm Mark Humphreys. Search for ABC Rewind and look for Scase, Fall of a Tycoon on the ABC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts.
ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Self-interest or doing the right thing? How evidence from one Snowtown murderer convicted the others. I'm Stephen Stockwell, and a heads up, this is a particularly violent case, so while we're avoiding details, we do still reference violent acts in this episode. Welcome to the case of Snowtown Parole.
The bodies in the barrels and now the bodies in the backyard.
11 people killed by the so-called Snowtown murderers.
James Vlassakis was involved in 4 murders between August 1998 and May 1999, serving life with a minimum of 26 years.
The youngest of the 4 men jailed over the murders has applied for parole.
Victims' families say he should never be released.
I'm astonished that we've even considered parole.
On the other side of this weekend, one of the Snowtown murderers will be on parole. James Vlassakis pled guilty to the murder of 4 people. He was jailed in 2001 for life with a non-parole period of 26 years. That term has now expired and he will be paroled. In our last episode, with the help of James Wakelin, a senior reporter for the ABC in Adelaide, we explained who Vlassakis is. And James, he was a bit different to the other key players, John Bunting and Robert Wagner, right?
Yeah, he was significantly different. He was by far the youngest of the killers. He had a mother who lived a fairly itinerant life. And there was also suggestions of abuse. So this was a very, very difficult upbringing. He was 14 when he met John Bunting. He came under his power. He left school at around that same age, and then he started becoming involved. He learned about the killings initially when he was about 16 years old and became involved himself when he was 18, 19. So certainly significantly younger than Wagner and Bunting, who were in their 30s when they were arrested in 1999.
And I mean, what was his life like around that period? Did he have a job? Was he going to school? What did it look like?
Well, he left school when he was 14 years old. He had a very dysfunctional upbringing. His father died when he was young, and then to move in with someone like Bunting, who was like a father figure to him, seemed like a fresh start for his life, and it obviously turned into a nightmare.
Yeah, and I mean, we finished our last episode, James, with Vlassakis kind of cooperating with police. You know, he came forward after the bodies were uncovered. He talked to police. He basically wanted a deal. He was looking for immunity, and when he left that interview, that's not what he got. What happened after he started talking to the police, after he started cooperating?
Well, he was charged straight away after that first interview with 1 count of murder. And then it was some time later, months, I believe, before he finally learned there would be no immunity deal for him. And he was charged with 4 counts and eventually pleaded guilty to 4 counts of murder. All happened late in the killing spree in sort of 98 and 99 when he was sort of around that 18, 19 years old. But yeah, he was certainly an instrumental figure in these killings towards the end, and he was also instrumental in collecting the unemployment benefits for those people that had been killed too, so that then effectively the killers lived off of the money that they got from the people they'd killed. Yeah,
it's really kind of gruesome, the whole thing, not just the details of what's happened, but, the kind of, I guess, the planned and the financial nature of it as well, taking the money from these people so people thought they were still alive. How significant was James Vlassakis' role in us understanding details like that, details about the collection of these benefits, details of how victims were chosen, all of those things?
Well, he was the key prosecution witness. He was the person that gave the detail to police and led to so much of this evidence coming in that led to Robert Wagner and John Bunting being found guilty of 11 and 10 murders respectively. Without him, the case would have been a lot harder to prove for some of these murders. I mean, one of them, police initially thought was a suicide until Vlassakis came forward and said, no, I know about this. He was targeted and killed, and they effectively made it look like a suicide where he was, we won't go into the details.
Yeah, no. If you are interested in learning a bit more about, the details of these murders, of the victims, I'll pop a link to an article that James and Rebecca Bryce have written, which takes you through the detail of these murders and also, an idea of who the victims were and what happened in all of that. So pop that in the show notes so you can read about that. It saves us going into the detail, the gruesome detail of these murders.
But it's also worth mentioning, Stocky, that some of it is just too horrific. We couldn't put a lot of stuff into those articles because it's just incredible and so disturbing what these men did. You really can't write all the detail of it.
I mean, there's a film that's been made about them that I haven't been able to bring myself to watch at this point because, it just, the gruesome detail that I have read and, even you saying that, that's not all the detail, having that portrayed is a lot, and we really, what we're interested in exploring here is not that detail. It's the process, it's the court case, it's the trials. And I mean, the trials of John Bunting and Robert Wagner, this was a huge undertaking in South Australia at the time in the early 2000s. This is a trial that went for 11 months, had hundreds of witnesses, had, thousands of exhibits. There was so much information presented over the course of this time. I mean, how significant was that trial in Adelaide when it was going on?
Well, the whole case was so significant for so many years. It was, we'd had obviously the terrible Truro murders that had happened, 10 or so years before. We'd had, the family murders that had taken the attention, I guess, of the public in South Australia too. So to have another one of these high-profile, horrible murder cases, the state, I guess, was pretty stunned that it was happening. And then, of course, to prove all these murders, so many of them, there was so much evidence that needed to be led over such a long period that it took years and it stayed very much front and centre in people's minds, for the best part of, 6 years.
You were present at, some of those trials, again, 11 months. So, I don't know if there was anybody who spent the entire period of that trial in that room watching it unfold. But, I mean, what was it like being in that room and what sort of things were you hearing?
It was particularly gruesome, some of the details. But at the same time, you were witnessing something that was important, something that needed to be done. I remember just the amount of lawyers in the room, the representatives that both men had, the prosecution, the detectives that were in there, and then, of course, the people that were there in the public gallery to see what was going on as well. It was full, and I guess it was almost always full because of the notoriety of the case.
One of the things, we've spoken a bit about already is, James Vlassakis' cooperation with police. And, he ended up giving witness at this trial. What was that like?
Well, James Vlassakis, like I say, was an absolute key part of what the prosecution were able to bring to the case. He is referenced a lot in the sentencing remarks, where he told specific details about when, so even if he wasn't there, Bunting would effectively come back and brag to him about what had happened. He showed him bodies, he gave him details, and then he was able to then put that together and tell the police about it. And also tell them about the recordings that were done as well, and the recordings were a crucial part of the evidence the prosecution used as well.
I mean, you talk about the recordings that were done. These are recordings that were made with victims to try and convince their family members that they were still alive. I guess that wouldn't have been information the police would get without the cooperation of someone like Vlassakis, right?
No, certainly it helps. It certainly helps. And some of it they found, and they were able to then go and listen and see what it was all about, what they were trying to do, and piece it all together. But certainly Vlassakis was a key part of understanding that, knowing that they existed. And the thing about these recordings, they didn't necessarily just get people to say a specific, sometimes they just said specific phrases like, I never want to see you again, don't call me, I'm moving away, I'm leaving, don't try and get in touch with me, and they would ring family members and play those to family members. But they also were getting to a point where they were starting to just get them to say words, and they would clip up phrases from victims and edit them and play those over the phone, so they could use different phrases and different terms to victims depending on the words that they used. They got more sophisticated as it went along. It was a fairly disturbing how they developed it.
James, in our last episode, we were talking about how John Bunting was motivated by this hatred of pedophiles. That was how he was, that's who he thought he was targeting when he was targeting these people or choosing people, choosing his victims. And about how he kind of conflated that. That was actually something he conflated with homosexuality. That wasn't, actually a very accurate target that he was working out. I mean, during the trial, did we hear much around the motivation from Bunting about targeting these groups?
Certainly. That was what they... I guess, while they didn't admit to any of the crimes, or certainly Bunting didn't, Wagner did plead guilty to a couple of the murders. The evidence that we heard was that they were pedophiles, they were dirty, they were basically a waste of oxygen, I think was another term that Bunting was heard to use. And a lot of that came from Vlassakis' evidence that he heard from Bunting himself. But you're absolutely right. Anyone who was of a homosexual orientation, he would basically see them as pedophiles, and that was enough for him. But the court found also that a lot of the victims were just in the wrong place, and they were potentially someone who was going to lead to the conviction of Bunting and Wagner. So they were people that they needed to get rid of, and the people around them were starting to get more and more fearful that they would become the next victims.
I mean, we've spoken about how James Vlassakis saw John Bunting as a kind of father figure, right? This is the male role model that he had growing up in these really poor parts of Adelaide. Giving evidence in the murder trial of this guy would have been just an incredibly strange situation to be in. But James, for him doing that, there were kind of concessions made. I mean, we still don't know what he looks like, do we? No,
that's right. There were heavy suppressions on James Vlassakis through the trial. Some of those have since been lifted, but one that hasn't been lifted and may never be lifted is that we can't show him. We can't show what he looked like with the pictures that we've got from him as a 19-year-old. And he obviously would look very different now as a person in his mid-40s. But we can't show those pictures and may never be able to show what James Vlassakis looks like.
What was the thinking behind that? Why was that done?
Well, largely because Vlassakis had turned Crown witness, it was to protect him from other prisoners. Those that turn Crown witness are known as dogs within prison and are often targeted. So protecting his image meant that there's some hope that he won't be targeted and people won't know who he is in prison. I'm not sure that. I think the prison population finds ways around that often. And hearing from the parole board around the time that he was granted parole. He had a difficult time while in prison because of that.
In our next episode, we'll talk all about that parole process, and there's other interesting details that I think people will be really surprised about when we get to that. When the trial of Wagner and Bunting wrapped up, after they were convicted of these murders, what did we hear from the judge during their sentencing?
Well, obviously there's a lot of detail that went in, but there was also a lot that wasn't in there. Because Wagner and Bunting effectively, with most of these murders, tried to say that they weren't involved, they needed to rely a lot on the evidence that was gathered from, Vlassakis largely, but also from the bodies themselves to see what these men had done to them. But there was, quite a bit of detail that came out as well.
What sort of detail are you talking about?
Well, they spoke about not just the use of these recording materials, but they talked about, unfortunately, the torture that a lot of these victims suffered at the hands of these men. And terribly, the judge spoke about how much they enjoyed it. Talked about that they weren't doing this because they were targeting pedophiles or homosexuals. They were doing this because they enjoyed it. And the money that they gathered at the end of it was just a byproduct. It wasn't the main reason for what they did. They did it because, it had become something they enjoyed more and more. And you can see it. They started back in 1992, but there wasn't another murder for another couple of years. But in the last couple of years before they were eventually caught, there were, that's when most of the murders occurred.
Yeah, it is such a brutal and confronting, murder or series of murders, right? We've got 11 murders that, this group was convicted of. What sentences were Bunting and Wagner handed at the end of that?
They were given the life sentence that you would expect for serial killers, but also they were given non-parole periods. So the judge effectively said, no, these men should never see the light of day again. There's no sign of contrition, and he said in his sentencing remarks that he could not see a time of them ever getting parole.
And James, 11 months is such a long time for a trial. Sometimes you'll have kind of federal court cases, really technical cases that will go for a very long time. But, criminal trials don't tend to go for almost a year. Was a lot of the reason for that just that there was so much evidence? So there were so many people who had to sit in the witness box and just be asked questions about what happened and what they remembered and what unfolded?
That's exactly right. You'll recall that they were actually accused of 12 murders, and they had to go through all the details surrounding those murders, all the witness statements. They had to go through all the evidence, the forensic evidence involved. Can you imagine being on that jury and saying to your work, sorry, I'm out, I'll see you in 12 months? But no, there was so much for them to do. And in the end, there was one victim, unfortunately, they couldn't reach a verdict on, and that was Suzanne Allen. So effectively, they could have had a retrial and gone back and had a look at that, but in the end, they decided not to, and they sat with those convictions for 10 murders for Wagner and 11 for Bunting.
Yeah, I imagine the amount of evidence, the number of witnesses. I think back to the Aaron Patterson trial and, like a few days of, cell phone tower evidence, right? Something like that. This you would have just weeks of forensic evidence, people talking about, the situations in the bank vault, the ways things were found in houses, all of that detail just being unpacked in such detail. And I can't imagine being on a jury having to sit through that for all of that detail for that amount of time, and then having to make a decision on all of that. There is a fourth person who was involved in these murders who we actually haven't spent much time on in this series. That was Mark Haydon. Now, he was charged with 2 murders, that of his wife and of Troy Yude, but the jury couldn't reach a verdict on them. Can you take me through his trial? What happened at that?
Yeah, Mark Haydon managed to get his own trial, so he was separated out from Wagner and Bunting by his lawyers. So he did. He faced the 2 murder charges and 7 charges of assist offender. And he was found guilty of the 7 charges of assist offender. He got 25 years jail and a non-parole period. I think it was around the 18-year mark.
And James, I mean, he's convicted of basically assisting these guys, assisting offenders. What did we hear during that trial about what he was doing, though? What was his role?
He was very much the lackey. He was the guy who would be transporting the bodies. He had barrels in the back of one of his cars for a period of time. He would be around while these murders were taking place. He would be storing and shifting and doing effectively what Bunting and Wagner wanted him to do, or Bunting really as the ringleader. His trial heard that he was getting more and more fearful that he was going to be murdered himself. His wife had been murdered. So their argument from his lawyers was that he was just sort of couldn't help but be dragged along because he could easily be the next person to be targeted.
I mean, in our last episode, you talk about the press conference, going to the press conference about the disappearance of his wife and realising that he's not there, that instead it's Elizabeth's brother who's at that. And, you know, when you ask that question, the kind of glance between the police officers and how telling that is. And I've been thinking about that, you know, a lot as they were getting closer to uncovering all of this. And if you haven't listened to our first episode with James on this, I recommend jumping back into the Case of feed and having a listen to that because, yeah, there's some really interesting insights from that episode. James, when we get to Vlassakis' trial, I mean, this is actually the first lot of the proceedings, and I say trial, there wasn't actually a trial. You know, he pled guilty to 4 murders. What did that mean for how that process unfolded of him being, I guess, convicted of them?
Well, he was the first to be dealt with. So he was, like I say, there were a lot of suppressions around him. So a lot of the detail really started coming out more during the Wagner and Bunting trials. But he got his life sentence, but he also got 26 years parole. They gave him the chance of actually getting out and getting a chance to live a life.
Yeah, and I mean, James, he's convicted of the murder of 4 people. Who were those 4 people?
Well, his first victim was his half-brother, Troy Yude. Then a short time later, Fred Brooks was killed. He was involved in that. And these are all happening in just a matter of months apart. And then there was Gary O'Dwyer, and then the last victim, David Johnson, who was murdered just days before the bodies were discovered.
I think we spoke about David Johnston in our last episode as well. Yeah, kind of lured to the bank vault in Snowtown. Most of these murders happening in the northern suburbs of Adelaide. But yeah, David Johnston lured to the bank vault in Snowtown and killed there. As you say, not long before this was all discovered and the arrests started being made. I mean, what was Vlassakis' relationship to these other people?
Well, the first victim that Vlassakis was involved with was Troy Yude, who was his half-brother. Now, he confided to Bunting that when he was 12, Troy Yude sexually abused him. And it was, after that Bunting then woke him up at some time in the middle of the night, and that's when they went and effectively killed Troy Yude in a house in Murray Bridge, which is another location where some of these murders took place. Now, I did read in the sentencing remarks for Bunting and Wagner that he would have actually got 42 years non-parole. So he'd be another 16 years away from getting parole if he hadn't assisted the police. So that was an interesting thing that I found in the sentencing remarks.
Do you remember much discussion as that kind of sentence was handed down in the early 2000s around him getting that non-parole period, about there being a point where, he may be allowed back out into the community?
I think there was, but at the same time, when you've got a 26 years sounds like a long time, and when you've got a very important figure who's turned on the people that he had murdered with, I don't think it was seen as something that was a terrible sentence at the time. It's only now when he starts facing the prospect of more or less getting out that people are starting to say there's no way he should get out. And certainly many of his victims' families believe that he should stay in jail forever.
Yeah, I mean, if everything goes to plan, by the other side of the weekend, he will be on parole. He'll be in the pre-release centre, spending some time there before, heading back into the community, obviously with the restrictions that parole comes with. We'll be looking into more of that in our next episode. James, thank you so much for taking us through this and giving us insight into these trials from the early 2000s. And look forward to having you back with Rebecca Bryce, one of your colleagues, for our next episode when we dive into basically what is happening at the moment.
Thanks, Docky. Thanks for the chat.
In our next episode, we will be finding out what happens from here, how the parole board made this decision to give James Vlassakis this opportunity, and get an idea of how the community in Adelaide has responded to it. If you have any questions for James, please get in touch. You can email thecaseof@abc.net.au. We really enjoy hearing from you and are planning a Q&A episode in the second half of next week to get to all your questions. So please get in touch. Be back in your feed early next week. So don't forget to jump on the ABC Listen app, because it's the best place to enjoy the case of. The Case of Snowtown Parole is produced by ABC Audio Studios and ABC News. This series is reported by senior reporter James Wakelin and presented by me, Stephen Stockwell. Our executive producer is Claire Rawlinson, and thank you to senior lawyer Jasmine Sims, our legal queen, for her continual advice, to the Adelaide newsroom, and to Audio Studios manager Eric George. This episode was produced on the land of the Kaurna and Wurundjeri people.
Hi, I'm Sam Hawley, host of ABC News Daily. It's a podcast explaining one big news story affecting your world in just 15 minutes. From ABC investigations to politics, the cost of living, to major global events. Expert guests and journalists join me to explain why the world works the way it does. Follow the ABC News Daily podcast on the ABC Listen app.